Well, I want to start out. I want to welcome our attendees tonight. And at this point at 6:30, we'll get started. I know some people may continue to join us, but I think, Jeff, this session is going to be recorded, correct, and available for folks afterwards? All right.
Yes, it is.
So if people want access to that, we'll make sure that we distribute that. Well, this is our, fourth and final Community Connections Town Hall series of the year. And I just want to start out and thank Jeff DeVeronica, who's been a tremendous asset in helping us to launch this series this year. So thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate all your support in this. And we've always known that communication has been extremely important here in what we do. But with this year in the pandemic, boy, it hasn't been any more important than what it has been this year, as far as making sure that we're keeping people well informed. So, so this has been a real blessing as far as getting this up and running. So with that, these town halls have been a great way of connecting with our families and with our staff and just sharing information. And what they've kind of evolved into is more of hopefully a dialogue. So if you're watching us tonight, if you're one of the if you're one of the participants at different points in the night, you can ask a question if you want to, and Mr. DeVeronica will pull you up, and you can actually interact with our panelists tonight. So for this fourth and final session, we had planned on kind of closing out the year and talking about the pandemic and transitioning from this year to next year. But if you're watching the news tonight, you know that there's still some information that we need from the state, and that's yet to reach the schools. So instead, we thought we'd put this time to good use and talk a little bit more about our culturally responsive education, and in particular, inquiry. And so this is something that I think has really resonated with our community members because it's kind of been a call to action this year around social justice. And it's helped us to kind of rethink some of what we're doing, but also consider the work that's been going on for more than the last 5 years. And so tonight we've invited some guests here with us. We have our Assistant Superintendent for Instruction, Chrissy Miga. We have our Director of 712 Instruction, Karen Finter. And we have our interim K6 Director of Instruction, Kim Cristal. And they're going to share a little bit of what's been kind of happening over the last 5 years, building to where we're at today. So I'm going to turn it over to Chrissy. Chrissy?
Thanks, Dr. Johnson, and good evening, everyone. We're very thankful that you're able to join us tonight so that we can share a little bit more about our approach and really some of our instructional practice that we are utilizing within West Irondequoit to support culturally responsive education. And so for tonight, we are going to dive deeply and share with you some examples regarding an inquiry approach. You also may have heard this as inquiry-based instruction. And we think this is really important to share with our community, as well as how we've shared it with our staff over time, because this type of approach really helps us to ensure that, one, all voices are being heard during any type of instruction, and two, that students are able to not just take in facts and be presented with facts or content, but they really are able to build an understanding about what they are learning. And so that's why we wanted to make sure that you as a community understood this inquiry approach. So Jeff, if we go to the next slide. So our essential question for this session is really going to be focused on, what is it like to learn in school today? And so for many of us, myself included, a lot of my instruction included sitting in a classroom. And even if I was in small groups or whole groups, a lot of it centered around the content that I was learning and taking in that content and being delivered that content. But really, over the past really multiple years, we have made a shift really in instruction and education in general to this more inquiry approach. And so we want to share today with you those instructional practices of inquiry-based instruction and how that helps us to facilitate and build a culturally responsive education. And so that's really the purpose of our discussion tonight. We realize that probably more questions will come from what we share. And so we'll be happy at the end to go to the Q&A as Dr. Johnson explained, but we want to give you a taste of what is it like to be a learner today and how does this structure that we are utilizing in West Irondequoit help us to have the conversations and instruction that is needed to support culturally responsive education. And so with that, I'm going to turn most of the discussion or the presentation tonight over to my very capable colleagues, Kim Cristal and Karen Finter.
Thanks, Chrissy. Go ahead to the next slide, Jeff, please. So we thought we would kick off this conversation by having you reflect back a little bit. As Chrissy mentioned, certainly education has changed over the years, and we really want to bring to the forefront how some of these practices really do lay the foundation for our forward work with culturally responsive practice or culturally responsive education. So I'd like you to think about your social studies or science class when you were in high school, or could even be elementary school when you studied those subjects, and type it into the question and answer box. What word or words would you use to describe what it felt like to learn in that classroom? What kinds of things did you experience as a student? How did it feel to really learn that science content or learn that social studies content? We'll give you a minute or two to type up in your responses. Somebody asked, where do we put them? Right in that question and answer is just fine. So somebody shared lectures, a lot of sitting and listening, information in, information out. At times broad, and sometimes it was limited when it came to social studies subjects, someone else shared. Detached, bland, not relevant, maybe lacking personal connection, some of the things that folks are typing in. Get a 20 seconds or so more. Pressuring and bland, kind of insignificant. ELA can be that way too. I think we can all agree, certainly, that the information age or the Google age has really called on all of us in education to shift practice. It's not so much about acquiring a vast amount of knowledge than it is about teaching kids to think critically for themselves when presented with key issues and critical understandings, critical events. And so tonight we're going to share with you some examples of how we do that. And we're also going to share what the direction will be like in the future for additional work in this area. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Jeff.
So thank you for your answers. It always reminds me of when I was a social studies teacher and people asked me what I did for a living, and I told them I was a social studies teacher, and without fail they said, oh, I hated social studies when I was in high school. And this is why. The reason why is because of the way it was taught back then. It was very, as you all so eloquently put, right? Lectures, information in, information out, irrelevant, bland. But at the end of the day, the teacher was at the focus, right? The teacher was the center, was the sage on the stage, was the knowledge giver. The focus was on memorization and recall, and that's pretty much where it stopped. Under the inquiry, you'll see some images from one of our own classrooms pre-COVID. Before I talk about what inquiry is, and I'm not going to have you type anything in the box, I just want you to take a moment and reflect how the description that we just created is similar or different to the images you see of students learning. Just give you like 10 seconds just to think about it. Oh, can you click again, Mr. De Veronica? And one more time. Thank you. So the way that we define inquiry-based instruction is using students' background knowledge and experience in conjunction with evidence, contextual understanding, and facts, where the teacher can facilitate students in practicing and applying their skills and constructing an understanding of these essential concepts. So I'm going to speak to it from a social studies perspective. Karen's going to give some science examples as well. But really, this practice is fairly universal. You can use this type of instructional practice across the board because really the idea is about putting the students in the center instead of the teacher, moving away from the picture of a lecture where the teacher stands in front and the students receive, and really bringing the students into that constructive experience where they are taking ownership of their own learning. Go to the next slide. We're going to take a look at a couple of examples, starting with one of my favorite ones. So this is an example from a grade 1 inquiry or evidence box. This letter was actually sent to students last year and the year prior, where they received a box, a mystery box containing artifacts. I'm going to show you a few images in a moment of examples of those items that they had. And students were tasked with helping me to figure out what was going on in that box. What was the connecting theme? They were pulling skills from their ELA comprehension. They were pulling skills from their critical social studies thinking practices, and from their own personal experiences to develop with their peers an answer. And then they got to write me letters telling me what they could add to the box that would fit under that idea, that broad idea. And so if you could click one more for me, please. So students would consider questions like, how does where I live shape what I do? And how does where I live shape who I am? And they would view some of these images in addition to some other artifacts we included and make observations, ask questions, make connections to these different visuals and artifacts to develop an understanding of what culture is and how where you live and who you are and what you do all connect together to make culture. And so this is very different than teaching students that there are 7 components of culture and it's only this way. And this is more of an organic, student-driven, understanding-based approach. And you can click to the next slide, please. This connects vertically to what they'll eventually start doing in 10th grade. So this is an example of an inquiry question that our global history and geography teachers in 10th grade use, where students look at the Industrial Revolution through the question, are the benefits of innovation worth the costs? So they may look at charts such as these, where they're looking at age distribution of workers in factories and life expectancy. And if you could click one more time, sir. And one more again. Thanks. They'll also look at the expansion of railway systems, as well as pollution. And so you can see through this example, students are looking at a variety of perspectives on what industrialization's impacts are. And then they determine, based on their perspective, what the answer to the question is. Because if I were to ask you, are the benefits of innovation worth the costs? There is not one answer to that question. And that's really the point, is that students are going to use facts, use evidence to construct understanding, and then draw their own conclusion based on that evidence. And these skills really translate into science. So I'll turn it on over to Karen.
Aaron, you're muted.
Sorry about that. This is just a snapshot of what some of our 4th graders experience as they progress through one of the learning modules in 4th grade for the sound unit. And so this is really how their understanding builds to that deep explanation layer. And it all starts with some background knowledge, right? How do we bring that out in our students? How do we give them exposure to different phenomena and different resources so that they can bring what they know about sound to the discussion and to the exploration. And then through some very carefully crafted lessons, they further layer in that understanding of, well, sound is a wave, sound can travel through a variety of different materials, And the wave characteristics really give you insight into how loud the sound is, how high or how low the sound is, that idea of pitch. And so this helps the kids build their understanding. And so to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like in the classroom, if you click to the next slide, please, Jeff. This is sort of the storyline that the kids are presented, right? They're presented with a phenomena or a problem. And it really underscores the story of how a national park superintendent works at the park and notices some behavior from the dolphins and what happens. And so first kids draw and deepen what they know, bring what they know with a model. So they craft a model, as a lot of scientists do out in the field. They start to build what their understanding is, and they continually add to it. So if you click, Jeff, you can see one of our examples of a student model. And this is pretty far along in that learning process. They've got particles or molecules represented in their model. They are showing the direction of the energy moving in the model. They show that idea of pitch and frequency in that model. So as they engage in learning experiences, they continue to add to their model. One other resource that they leverage and utilize, if you click, Jeff, is a simulation where students can independently adjust variables and observe what happens when they shift and change those different variables. And this happens to be a simulation with this particular science program that we utilize. And so students can pick different instruments. They can play them on their computer to see what happens if to the molecules if they make the sound a lot louder, what happens if they go into a higher pitch on that instrument. And they can really see the relationship between the molecules, the movement of the sound waves at a molecular level to the different instruments that they've picked. So this is just another example of how inquiry lives even in our younger classrooms, even in subjects like science that tended to be, back in the day, some hands-on, but it truly was, there was a body of knowledge that you had to memorize, that you had to understand. And it shifted beyond that into a much more experiential opportunity for our kids. Go ahead to the next one, Jeff.
So that brings us to the next component of our talk tonight, really looking at how this type of instruction connects with culturally responsive education and the ongoing work we're seeking to do as a district. So let's dig in. What we're really looking at here is how we're ensuring that all students are feeling empowered and engaged in the learning regularly in their classrooms across the K-12 spectrum. To do that, we're trying to implement culturally responsive and sustaining practices, which have been outlined by New York State in the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. We're going to talk a little bit about that framework before we talk more about the connection between inquiry and culturally responsive. But I do want to, before we move on, draw your attention to the image on this slide. This is taken from the framework. Among the other things that I like about this image, my favorite part is the trunk, that students are the focal point, the center, the reason why we are here, which is why inquiry-based instruction couples so nicely with this instructional approach, because both place all students, every student, at the center of their learning and their educational experience. Next slide, please. There are 4 distinct principles outlined in the culturally responsive sustaining framework, and we're going to briefly give an overview. You can access this online, and we're happy to share that resource. I think we even have it linked off of our website. But there are 4 basic principles: welcoming and affirming environment, high expectations and rigorous instruction, inclusive curriculum and assessment, and ongoing professional learning. Welcoming and affirming environment speaks to ensuring that the environment within the school building, within the classroom, within all elements of a student's educational experience are truly inclusive of all students' perspectives, and that every student feels welcomed, engaged, and empowered by the community that they are a part of. High expectations and rigorous instruction really speaks to the promise that we make that every student is challenged by their learning and their growth is fostered, so that no student at any level is being withheld from a rigorous instruction, right? Every student is getting that high expectation and getting that, that crucial challenging experience from their learning. The inclusive curriculum and assessment speaks to the importance of ensuring that our curriculum includes diverse perspectives and diverse voices, making sure that the content and the resources bring in those different perspectives, but also students of diverse perspectives are given space and voice during their instructional experience. The ongoing professional learning is really speaking to the sustaining component of this work, that this work is evolving, that our students are ever changing and their needs are evolving. And so if we are to ensure we're maintaining those three components every year for every student, it has to be an ongoing work, a reflection that we are constantly engaging in. And so that's why that's the fourth component. What's really, really impressive about this document, and I would strongly encourage you to take a peek at it, is that they outline these principles for all stakeholder groups within a community. So students, teachers, building leaders, district leaders, community members and families, higher education, and New York State Department of Education. So what we're going to do is take a little bit of a look at how this framework fits into our district and how this is going to influence our instruction. Turn over to Karen.
So, as we think about the framework that Kim walked us through, it's really grounded as our all of our work on the New York State standards. So we have content standards. I'm sure you've heard of our next generation ELA standards and mathematics standards, the social studies framework. But there are also frameworks from New York State around culturally responsive and sustaining education, as well as social and emotional learning. And so those frameworks really help to drive the scope of what our students' education is here in New York State. We take those standards and at a local level, unpack them. You doing that as a collaborative process with teachers, administrators, to get input into the priority standards, and use those to develop our scope and sequence documents, our unit maps, and even common assessments, so that we can really make sure that our level of instruction and our level of rigor is matched to those standards and beyond. Because as Kim said, one of those tenets is really to challenge all of our students, and we strive to do that here in West Arundecoit. From those collaboratively developed curriculum documents, teachers within their classrooms do have some autonomy. They may pick different reading materials. Oh, can we just go back one, please, Jeff? They may pick different articles or textbooks, multimedia, and those teachers will create their own tasks and learning experiences. At the last forum, you learned a little bit more around some of the inquiries that are being piloted this year and full implementation. And those inquiry-based lessons live at that instructional planning and resource level, but they really stem from the standards. Go ahead to the next one, Jeff. Thank you. So when you hear about culturally responsive instruction, tonight we want to clarify what it is and do a little bit of work to demystify what it isn't. And so when we talk about culturally responsive instruction, things that we really want to bring to life is that it's inclusive, that what we're asking is that teachers showcase multiple perspectives. And as Kim illustrated in her 10th grade global history example, that kids really grapple with those multiple perspectives to draw conclusions. Students have voice and agency, that we do recognize and applaud diversity and welcome diversity. And we want kids to have that understanding. We want to make sure that we're drawing a connection to our students' needs and what's happening in the classroom. So these elements really make up some of the articulated components of culturally responsive instruction or culturally responsive practice. Go ahead to the next one, Jeff, please.
Okay. So as Karen so clearly illustrated, I hope that by this point it's evident, and please put questions in the Q&A if you have any. Why inquiry-based instruction we're coupling it with culturally responsive and sustaining practices. We're really looking to ensure that as we engage students in grappling with potentially difficult and very important issues in their learning, that they feel that they have the space to explore perspectives, and that they feel safe to disagree with one another and still walk out of the classroom as friends. That's really what we're seeking to engage students in, that civic learning, to ensure that they feel comfortable with diverse opinions in a room, and recognize that those are elements of a healthy democracy. And so what we'd like to do before we really open it up for questions is just take a quick moment, as Karen said, and really talk about what culturally responsive sustaining education is and what it isn't. Next slide, please. So culturally responsive education is about exposing students to diverse racial, ethnic, religious, gender, and sexual orientation, political, and personal perspectives, really looking to ensure that all students feel included in the learning. I want to pause on the phrase political, as I know that that might have raised some ears for people. If you think about, for example, our senior class, which is participation in government, they're talking about politics. It's one of the standards, actually. But they're not talking about politics in the sense of which one is right and which one is wrong. They're talking about the politics in a sense of exposure. These are the different issues that are being discussed. These are the different perspectives of this issue. And here's the different components of evidence that people use to portray their thinking, similar to the inquiry that I used as a 10th grade example. And so when we talk about exposing students to these diverse ideas, it's really about giving them the space to explore those ideas and draw those conclusions, eventually preparing them to enter the world with a clear sense of what it is that they believe and what it is they still have questions about. It also means creating the conditions that all students can access challenging and rigorous learning experiences that promote growth and learning. It's really been a mantra of our district for a long time that every student belongs to all of us. When we say all, we mean all students. And that really connects to this idea of challenging and rigorous learning. We want to make sure that, for example, if a student is a struggling reader, they're still being challenged in their critical thinking. They're not only looking at texts that are at a lower lexile or lower reading level so that they can access it, but they're still getting that opportunity to feel challenged, to grow, and to recognize their strengths as well. And so this is really our definition of culturally responsive education. I do hope that that clarifies and addresses any issues that I'm sure, just looking at the Q&A, it might be coming up. So I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, so I think in a moment, we'll turn it over to the question and answer portion. But again, we hope to share this information with you so that you can best understand our approach to culturally responsive education. And again, this is of course one component. It's not all. Culturally responsive education does not just equal inquiry-based instruction, but this is an approach that we're utilizing that we feel best supports students and really develops a strong and sustaining understanding for our students. Again, in all content areas as well. So this is a practice that we're using really K through 12. And so we know that there may be additional questions, and we're happy to take those now. And just know that this is work that's ongoing. So I think it was a couple weeks ago now, I sent out a letter as Assistant Superintendent for Instruction, just to kind of get a heads up as to what is some of the work to come. And so we're working on that common and clear definition of culturally responsive education in West Irondequoit. And we're working to put pieces in place so that our curriculum will be culturally responsive, and that becomes a systematic process of our curriculum review, so that it's something that isn't just an in the moment shift, but it's something that does sustain, no matter who are the people that are in different roles, or the different teachers that might be at different buildings. So it lives past any particular person or group. And so that is the work that we're going to continue to do, and we're really excited to do. We've felt such great support from the community, from levels of appreciation, but also lots of questions. And that's why we thought it was so important to hold this tonight, because we know that there comes a lot of questions with this work, and we hope to be transparent and help you to understand this really good, important work that's going on.
If anyone has a question and wants to verbalize it rather than type it out, they can raise their hand, and that will put you right up to the front of the queue, and I can open up your microphone. So now would be the time for questions. If you want to type it out, you're welcome to do that in the Q&A. Stand by.
I feel that there's a, this is, I'm using my dad's iPad, don't worry about the name. I feel like in schools, there's a lot of bias going around, especially LGBT plus phobia and ableism. How do you plan to tackle that? With the same approach as the other things, or something else? Because I got bullied a lot because of, well, not that much, but I did get bullied sometimes because of my autism.
Thank you for sharing your question and for participating tonight. And sure, there will be components of an inquiry approach that would support building and understanding, but we've done some other things as well, because a lot of this work is shifting. We talk a lot about a growth mindset in education. So a lot of this is looking at a mindset to be open and really accepting and understanding of all people. And so we've done some work already around implicit bias. So at the leadership level, that started to be given at our building level with our teachers. And we've done some work around social emotional learning as well to help these type of conversations and those courageous conversations start to happen with students as well. So for example, and I know both Kim and Karen can speak even better to this, but this year, with the ongoing pandemic, one of the things that we really focused on as a district was social emotional learning. And within that, the availability for students to have time to talk about what's going on with them, with others, and really think about what is life right now and what are the important components to it. So at the high school, for example, and I don't know if Mrs. Finter, you want to talk a little bit to our peak hours and what those have supported?
Sure. So, one of the silver linings in the pandemic was really thinking about how can we build community and build strong relationships within our structures. And so we put together what is PEAK. PEAK is a small group advisory, where all staff members from Dake and the high school are paired with a small group of students. And there have been some different approaches to PEAK in both Dake and the high school, but really it's an opportunity to have some collaborative conversation around different issues or events or wonderings or celebrations to build community in that way. And it was a good trial run for us. We've learned a lot about what it takes to get that kind of relationship established between our kids and our staff, and how to really leverage that to grow their awareness and to make the high school that's, a building with, on a given normal non-COVID year, 1,200 students in it on a daily basis, to make that big place seem a little bit smaller and to make kids feel included and connected to it. And so we're going to continue that work post-COVID and still are thinking about and getting input from our students about what they would like to see and how it could continue. Because I think at the heart of it, it really is about bringing in that student voice and that student agency. I don't know, Mrs. Cristal, if there's anything you wanted to add?
Good. Also, is there anyone else watching this right now? Because I'm horrified.
There are people watching this, and we're taping it as well.
Hopefully, none of them are any of my classmates who hate me.
Well,
Also, is this meeting over? It feels kind of quiet.
I want to make a statement, before I turn it over to Ms. Cristal. Number one, I really appreciate you coming on as a student and taking an interest in our curriculum, our instruction, and what we're teaching, and how we're facilitating what Mrs. Finter said is a sense of community in our district. And one thing I want to point out here is that, going back to the New York State culturally sustaining framework, culturally responsive and sustaining framework, one thing we're working on is coherence. And I just want to pull out of that the welcoming and affirming environment. It sounds like for you, you've had a very traumatic experience in that sector of this specific framework. And that's
Yes.
something that we need to improve. We've made a commitment to you as our students to make sure that our classrooms and our buildings are welcoming and that you feel safe, heard, and you're able to participate, all right, in a healthy way that promotes your wellness. And so we're going to continue to work on that, but building that sense of community. Part of this also includes restorative practices and talking about how we can have constructive dialogue and how we can eliminate bias and hate from really our system. And again, it's a work in progress. I just want to say thank you for coming on and joining us and sharing your story, because to me, it affirms the work that we're doing. It only strengthens my commitment as a superintendent in making sure that we follow this through. So thank you.
You're welcome. And the knowledge that I'm extending this is making me feel sick to my stomach, so I'm gonna just mute myself now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I just want to jump in there though, and just again, compliment our student, just as Dr. Johnson just had, because you've just given a great example of socio-political awareness in which you have advocated for yourself. And even though it was tough and difficult, you took this step to let your voice be heard. And that is exactly what we're hoping that our curriculum can do for students. So I just want to say that I'm very proud of you, and I hope that you continue to speak up.
Okay, Darren, you are live now, Darren.
Oh, great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Yeah, I put a question in the Q&A, and I was just inquiring about how this program relates to what I hear a lot about on different forums about critical race theory. Is this just another name for critical race theory? And if it is, how are you using the inquiry base to introduce some of the concepts and terms like Black Lives Matter and white privilege?
So to answer your first question, no, this is not another name for critical race theory. Critical race theory is specific to issues around systemic racism and focus specifically on mostly legal issues, and then that has taken on some other policy areas as well. Culturally responsive education is really looking at a much broader spectrum of identity. And so while race is an element for sure, we're looking to diversify our resources, make sure that multiple voices are heard. That's not code for only diversifying by race. When we say diversify, we mean diversify by race, by ethnicity, by socioeconomic status, LGBTQ plus voice, different family structures. I mean, the list really goes on, and really making sure that every student identity and collection of identities, because really a person is not defined by one identity. We're all a combination of lots of different things. And so we want to make sure that our students feel reaffirmed in that and feel an opportunity to develop confidence in who they are and who they want to become through their instructional learning. And so I just wanted to start with that one right off the bat. So before I move on to any of your other questions, did you have any follow-ups for that one piece?
Well, I guess it kind of, you can answer it after the rest of your response. And well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for taking my questions. I really appreciate the opportunity and the forum, and it's very informative meetings so far. But so is West Irondequoit incorporating the critical race theory in some other type of curriculum, or is it going to be embedded inside of this curriculum?
No one theory is promoted over another. I can't think of any example of where critical race theory would enter into our curriculum. We do talk about issues of racism. Unfortunately, that comes up a lot in social studies, especially in all of the topics really. But
Sure.
The idea is to really look at those issues from a historical perspective, or from a community member perspective, or whatever the different perspectives might be, to make sure that students have the space to really grapple with these issues, because they're very difficult issues to understand and talk about. And our belief really is that if we don't give space to students to really get in there and figure out how to talk about this, then we're really not preparing them to enter the world with the ability to talk about some of these issues. So no, critical race theory is not being incorporated into our curriculum. There will be discussion around race and racism, but that is not critical race theory at all. No.
Okay, well, that's excellent. Thank you for that. So as far as addressing those two
Sure.
phrases or terms, I'm just a concerned parent that our children are going to be shamed or feel guilty for being who they are, and it's a very political topic that I just don't think the young impressionable kids as young as kindergartners are really should be told or exposed to concepts that are just so one-sided. Unless I like the idea of the inquiry base, that seems very positive. So I guess I'm just wondering, how are those two things being introduced or brought up to the kids so that I can be prepared when my daughter comes home from school and the dinner table brings these terms up, and I just want to know what the district is planning on explaining to her.
Yes. Well, so I would say straight off the bat that these terms are not a part of our K-1-2 curriculum. However, I'm a former high school teacher. So as I started working K-12 and most recently K-6, I can tell you that students ask really specific questions. And so teachers have really undergone a lot of training so that should a student bring up a question about any of these topics, or really anything, they are prepared to either figure out a way to answer a student's specific personal question that might not be appropriate for the class, or identify ways to discuss the various perspectives around an idea or around a term, making sure that they're not necessarily promoting one over the other, but really giving students the space to grapple with the term. So for example, if the Black Lives Matter movement were to come up and say, like, a 4th or 5th grade classroom, in 4th grade, they do talk about the abolitionist movement. And so students do naturally make that connection to the Black Lives Matter movement, whatever their perspective may be, just because of the similarities in the topics. Teachers have really undergone a lot of training in how to help students understand the purpose of the movement and understand what that movement is fighting for without promoting it, and also being able to help students understand the other side of that perspective as well. Really no student should ever feel shamed or anything like that as a result of their learning. That would not be culturally responsive. We really want students to make sure that they feel included in the discussion, and as I mentioned earlier, that they feel safe to disagree with one another. Students should be able to belong in a community where not everyone agrees all the time, and that's okay.
Absolutely.
And then of course, if you ever have a dinner table question, you can always reach out to any one of us or to the classroom teacher. And I'm sure they're happy. Our teachers have been amazing in communicating ahead if there are any topics that are planned that might come up at the dinner table to make sure families are informed. But, you know, always the door, the email door, the phone call door, whatever door you want to use is always open.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was an excellent response, and I'm happy to hear the commitment by the teachers and the administrators over there in West Irondequoit. I'm very happy with my daughter's teachers, my daughter's principal, and this is a great meeting. I'm glad I was invited and got the ability to ask some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Reminder to everybody, if you do want to raise your hand and ask a question, now would be the time to do it. Okay, we have one coming in right now. Let's move that there. And
There's
Danielle, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jeff. There's a question in the chat about examples of culturally responsive education as it relates to diverse perspectives, diverse racial perspectives. Will this be in the form of literature from authors, teaching more historic events that are not as well known, or beyond that? Yes to all of the above. And I think that, you know, certainly through some of the earlier presentations, maybe you've heard a little bit about the Strong Voices Project, which really is K-12, starting to look at some of the texts that kids engage with in their ELA classrooms or in their grade level classrooms to really represent the variety of genders, races, perspectives that that exist. And so how can we craft lessons that help to bring that alive? And then really, again, looking at those historic events, but bringing in those diverse perspectives, multiple perspectives for kids to consider what that entailed. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, all of the above and more. But through the summer and into next year, you'll hear more and more about how that work is continuing and taking shape within our classrooms.
Okay, I believe Danielle would like to ask a question. Danielle, you have the ability to unmute. There you go.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thank you for holding this forum. It's definitely been very informative. I am new to West Irondequoit. This is my son's first year. And I wanted to be a part of this meeting tonight because of some of the concerns I had with him being in West Irondequoit, as far as him being the only Black boy in his class right now. So he's at the elementary level. So that was just a concern that like I had, just him being the only Black person and how he was going to adjust to that. And so one experience that we have had is that he came home and told me that, you know, someone pointed out like, did you notice like you're the only brown person in the classroom, right? But I know it was very innocent because they're only in first grade. So, you know, I was able to just see that, you know, it was a very innocent response. Kids are just very observant. But, you know, I allowed him to express how he felt, and he kind of felt like he was different. So my question is just like, at what level does this conversation begin as far as like culture and how to include everyone? As far like when you're talking about culturally responsive education, like what does that look like at the elementary level? And I guess I still kind of check in with him about how he's feeling about that comment. But I talked to my son about, you know, his identity and who he is, and, you know, how he's special, and, you know, like he's just an amazing person, you know, even though he may look different from other people, right? So those are the conversations that I have with my son at home, but obviously I don't know what conversations other people have with their children. So I'm just curious of like, what does this look like at the elementary level?
Yeah, and I think that what you've shared, and thank you so much for sharing, is a great example of what we are trying to incorporate really K through 12. So starting in kindergarten and addressing and making sure that students are exposed to diverse characters. They're hearing stories of all different backgrounds. And so, you know, a big part of culturally responsive education is celebrating the cultures of the students in the classroom, in the community. And so that's why, you know, there was a question about perspectives. Why, you know, who decides what perspectives are allowed? Well, one of the things that we're going to use to drive that, and this is really based on some of it's really culturally, I think it's sustaining pedagogy, and I'm just thinking of the researcher's name, but it's not at the tip of my tongue right now, but it's really based in that idea that, you know, the students in front of you, and then your curriculum responds to the makeup of the community. And so that all perspectives are included, but also there's a diverse representation. And so that down the road, it doesn't become something that is shocking for students when there's someone not like them, or there's someone different than maybe the one perspective or the one background that they've learned about. And so this is a work in progress. So I also don't want to make it seem like Miss Jones, like this is already work that we've completed and your child will walk in and it's up and running perfectly. This is the work that we're working on. And when I, at the beginning, spoke to the work on curriculum that we're trying to put in place that is sustaining, we want to make sure that we have a way to review our curriculum that allows us to check, you know, who is represented by the books that they're reading, by the problems that they're tackling, by the stories that they're hearing, by which parts of history are we including or not, and what does that represent. And so that is the work that is ongoing. So again, not that we're at the point where it's perfect today, but those are the things that we want to cultivate starting in kindergarten. And so Karen already referenced our Strong Voices program at K through 12. And the one thing that we did want to implement this year was providing a diverse read aloud. So just different backgrounds and cultures that are represented at every grade level, and trying to make that, again, systemic. So ensuring that every student is going to get these different read alouds at particular grade levels, where it makes sure that it shows and represents the community that we live in. And so along with those, creating some questions for teachers to help them guide the conversation so that they might not ask that type of question of your son in the future. They might understand that there are lots of people with lots of different backgrounds out there. So that's just kind of the bigger picture question. Kim, I don't know if, bigger picture answer to your question. But Kim, I don't know if you have anything else to add at the elementary.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of piggyback off of what you just talked about, but the social studies curriculum, especially at the K3 level, has really undergone quite a facelift, really looking to ensure that students are learning how to talk about diversity, learning how to talk to each other about differences and similarities, and finding ways to draw those connections that go beyond physical features, right? Really looking at how our culture as a Irondequoit community brings us together, and how we're not just a member of an Irondequoit community, but also in New York and the United States and the world, and what that really means for our kids as they go through those K1, 2, 3 levels, so that when they do get into 4th grade and start to actually look at history, because that's the first grade level where they really dive into historical narrative, they have the framework to really understand the wide array of perspectives that history really includes, and gives them some sort of foundation to start to understand that information, so that it's, like as Chrissy said, it's not shocking to them to see that there's not just one right answer or one right way, but there's a really wide variety. And that also speaks to the perspective question that Chrissy referenced too, really making sure that that there is not one right perspective, that so long as those perspectives are really based on that evidence, and really teaching students that critical informational literacy, right, that students are knowing how to consider various perspectives, use evidence to draw their conclusions, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, so there are a couple of questions in the chat, Kim, I think that you were speaking to a little bit. One is about, who decides which perspectives are allowed? And really, again, I go back to that, how is our curriculum developed in the first place, right? So we do have anchor in content, we have anchor in state standards. And so if it's perspectives around, the Revolutionary War, there are a variety of different perspectives that students can analyze and take a look at. They can take a look at the colonists, they can take a look at the British, they can take a look at the Native American perspective from all sides, then really driving to some of the compelling questions that they grapple with in social studies at 7th grade or in US history. And so, it is anchored to content, it is anchored to fact. It isn't just about everyone all day sharing their own individual perspectives. It's really towards those learning goals and those content goals that are stemmed from the standards. I don't know, Kim, if there's anything more to add there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I do see a question there. When did this shift from lecture to inquiry happen? Ongoing. And is it universal, New York or West Irondequoit at this point? I can speak to this work growing across the state. I would definitely say that, we're moving in that direction as a county. But the National Council for Social Studies has also been promoting the inquiry-based instructional program. And so it is a national movement of the social studies to move away from that. This is the only way to understand it, to this is what happened. And these are all the different perspectives about why it happened. And let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from the science perspective, we are very excited to be embarking on the next generation science standards from New York State that are born from national standards and really are a more authentic way, honestly, to learn the sciences, where you grapple with real issues, real phenomena, and you try to build meaning and make meaning. And it is the content, but it's also the science and engineering practices. It's also the concepts that span across disciplines. It's not just one living environment tower of knowledge and one earth science tower of knowledge. It really crosses between. And I think too, some of the other pieces, it is in curriculum, but it is it comes alive in classroom conversation. So I think about, I was a former science teacher, 7th and 8th grade and high school. And, thinking about the scientists we would study, a lot of old white men. That didn't mean there weren't women that contributed to the field, that there weren't African-American or Black scientists that contributed to the field, that there weren't other contributors that didn't fit that one single gender normed role. And so, I think it's providing kids an opportunity to see people like themselves in potential fields or career paths or their bright futures, whatever it may be. And how are we really kind of helping to support that too? That's also part of this culturally responsive education practice that's happening in our classrooms.
I did see a question that sort of follows up to what Ms. Finter and I were just talking about around, are there non-negotiable perspectives or beliefs that are not tolerated? At what point are racist or ableist or sexist ideas or words or actions called out? Excellent question. Thank you for that. So because our priority is to ensure that our learning environment is welcoming and inclusive, any kind of language that is going to be hurtful or offensive to another member of that community is something that we do not allow in our classrooms. But I avoid the phrase call out because, as I also mentioned, we don't want any students to walk out of any learning environment feeling ashamed or feeling a sense of shame. And so instead, we're exploring various ways to help build those expectations before those comments are given so that students know what is not acceptable to say within a classroom. And then should that occur, teachers have undergone a lot of training, and there's a lot more training coming down the road so that they can resolve conflict between students that may arise, that they can help students learn how to deal with their differences in a respectful manner, and not fall back on any kind of discriminatory phrasing, whether it be based on race or ableism or gender or political beliefs or perspectives or anything. Really, we want to make sure students are prepared to enter the world in a way where they can relate with anybody, and speak and engage with anybody, and even express disagreement in a respectful way.
And I want to go back to a previous question. And a question, why are we so focused on identity? You know, how are we, or should we be focusing on the actual facts, and how can we teach kids facts? And, you know, are these identity issues, do they have a place in the educational system? And I want to actually speak now to some of the work that we've been doing as well around social emotional learning and the impact that has on student performance. So absolutely, as Ms. Finter referenced, all of our curriculum is driven from standards. So it is driven from what is the content that needs to be achieved in each grade or in each content area. But you know, one of the things that we've really been researching over the past few years and have dove into headfirst as a district is looking at that whole child and understanding how some of those soft skills, as they might be called, really impact students' ability to retain and apply those facts. And so, for example, I'm going to give a really specific example from right here in West Irondequoit. I think it's 5 years ago now, we moved from half day to full day kindergarten. And we pretty much kept the curriculum and as is. But what we looked deeply at was how could our approach shift? So how could we make more connections between the curriculum that was in place, between the content areas, and how could we support students in social interaction, and to pull some of the SEL competencies out, that self-awareness and that personal responsibility? How could we promote those skills within the kindergarten classroom, in addition to making sure that they know the facts and have those academic skills? And what we've seen year after year is, as we shifted to making sure that the whole child was really supported in full day K, we see every year the academic scores actually getting stronger and stronger for our kindergartners. So our kindergartners, you know, when we started a shift to full day K, they were, for some of our grade level proficiency scores, we had, you know, between 75 and 80% of all students reaching grade level proficiency. And now with that shift to address the whole child and really making sure that students not only understand what they're learning, but what about them helps them in their learning, we see those scores at between 90 and 100% proficiency. And so that's just I wanted to provide a concrete example around how, yes, the facts are absolutely important, but it is also our job to help them understand how to take in those facts and keep them with them for the long run. So just wanted to share that information now.
Chrissy, I want to be mindful of our participants' time tonight, and just take a moment here to maybe give the 2-minute warning if there's final questions. I see one question that popped up around the word offensive and how potentially that may be challenging in the work that we're describing here. I think that's a great thought, a great question, you know, and something that to me goes back to that whole idea of the sense of community that we're building within our students and staff, and the fact that we are incorporating restorative practices into our everyday life in our classrooms. And you know, we're promoting this dialogue, but there is a clear difference between something that crosses a line in regards to our code of conduct or code of ethics that we have as a school district, and things that are, you know, as we're talking right now, part of this inquiry process. So I know that may be a little bit of a gray answer to you, but the word offensive doesn't necessarily mean that it would be something that isn't tolerable in a discussion. And that's something as I think about how our team is describing this process. A lot of this has to do, a very critical factor of this is preparing our staff to manage these discussions. And so that's the professional development that's happening now. And when do we pull a student off to the side and have that conversation with them? And when do we not? When is that part of that productive dialogue and that inquiry process that we're describing? But anyone on the panel want to jump in on that one? And then we'll take any final questions. Great job tonight. Great questions. Sufficient wait time?
I see no other hands up, Dr. Johnson.
All right. I want to end on this, and then I'll give an opportunity for if there's any other comments from the team tonight. What an amazing team. Very proud of the work that's happening in West Irondequoit and the leadership that we have across the board here. And you know, a big part of this that I think I've realized in the last year since being part of this team is the whole idea of coherence. And the way that this was presented tonight, I'm hoping that you're walking away feeling that there's a sense of coherence and that things have been done strategically and intentionally in building this culture and climate and following what the state put forth in their culturally responsive and sustaining framework. And that really is our platform. That's really our foundational roots in this work. All right. And I want to make sure that we're continuing to draw ourselves back to that because that's a really information. That's a rich document when you take a look at that. And everything that we described tonight can kind of be traced back to that work that was put forth in that framework. And so again, I think part of what I've heard as a superintendent with our community, myself included, we've all been kind of trying to make sense of all these different branches and the things that are being introduced to the conversation along the way. And as those things continue to happen, we're going to bring it back to the table and have these discussions and continue to anchor ourselves back to some of these guiding documents. So appreciate the effort by the team tonight. You guys did a great job. If anybody out there that's listening has any questions or anybody who views this at a later time, please feel free. You know, this is a collaborative process. We are creating curriculum together. So just reach out to any one of us or any of our building leaders. So with that, anyone on the team have anything else to say before we close out for the night?
Just thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. I did put a link to the New York State Framework in the chat if you want to take a look at it. We really appreciate your support and your questions tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen, for doing that. All right, once again, great job tonight from the panelists, and thank you everybody for joining us. And this will be our last community connection for this year. We may have one over the summer. Otherwise, we'll see you in the same format next year. Thank you.